Welcome, viewers of BeyondPhrenology, to this new episode of BeyondPhrenology. It's been a while since we had an episode because the semester had been quite busy with lots of new developments in the lab and grants and articles. So we are here nonetheless, and this time we are here with Associate Professor Dr. Alexandra Paxton from UConn. She is very closely associated with CESPA, Center for the Ecological Study of Perception and Action. We kind of are familiar with each other's work for quite a long time now. Alexandra runs a lab. She's the lab director of the Dyscord Lab. The Dyscord Lab, is it's a little different than what it seems like. It's DYSCORD and not DISCORD. It explores the dynamics of social communication and interorganism dependencies. So basically, she investigates social interactions in more dynamical and ecological frameworks. There are very few people in psychology and neuroscience I know who study more than a human, if at all. And she's one of those people who studies more than one human at a time. So it's a kind of rare field, and it's also very difficult and challenging to study. And we also discussed, in one of the last podcasts with one of the guests that, he proposed that, the future of neuroscience is probably meta-neuroscience, where we study a lot of humans, we scan them, hyperscanning, basically. So it kind of fits well with the theme. So welcome, Alexandra, to BeyondPhrenology.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be
And
here.
well, and I will ask you to, first respond to our viewers, uh, kind of telling them how you get to be on BeyondPhrenology. Like, what exactly was your career and what exactly was your contribution that finally you end up here today with us?
Well, it is an honor to be here. So I started off with I don't know, how far back do you want me to go? Like undergrad? What how do you
I mean,
how far?
if you think there was a childhood incident at 3 years old which
Oh,
determined, your trajectory, then we would like to hear that as well.
um yeah, so I don't have anything quite that exciting. I started undergrad. My undergrad career was psychology and English. I had goals to become a clinical psychologist, and various things conspired to have me end up in research instead. I got my PhD from University of California, Merced in cognitive and information sciences, did a postdoc in cognitive science and data science at University of California, Berkeley, and the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. And then I started here at the University of Connecticut in the Department of Psychological Sciences as a faculty member in 2018, and I've been delighted to be here ever since. You and I know each other from various social and research circles from ecological psychology, and I got here because I got a wonderful email inviting me to be part of this fantastic podcast slash YouTube cast. Is this also on YouTube? Okay. Um, what whatever this is,
Yeah.
this multimedia empire that you are building. So that's how. So just keep plugging away, people. If you want to be on this podcast, just keep plugging away, and Major will look around and may deign to send you an email as well.
Well, thanks, Alexandra. So,
Yeah.
you work with Mike Spivey, is it?
Mm. No, I worked with Rick Dale.
With
So
retail,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But
So Rick Dale was Mike Spivey's graduate student, though. So he's, in my academic lineage.
I see. Okay, okay. That
Yeah.
makes sense because he was the one who proposed,
Oh,
hyperscanning is one of the
yeah, yeah,
future.
yeah. That makes sense.
Right. So yeah, so UC Merced is also a powerhouse of, this kind of work,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the
Mm-hmm.
last decade.
Yep.
Of course, a lot of things have been inspired from the early work at UConn, and you are definitely at like the mecca of this kind of work. So that's pretty nice. So
I feel
Alexandra,
very lucky to be here.
yes. So so I would start with, like, why do you study, the dynamics of social communication? So first of all, like, social communication, what's the end goal? What are we trying to understand there? And when you say
Mm.
dynamics, so why dynamics?
Yeah. Yeah, those are big questions. So, for me, I like I said, I came from this being really interested in kind of a clinical approach. I was interested in people who had, and trying to help people who had difficulties connecting with one another and aggression issues. And from that, I noticed that there was I was really drawn to understanding how people connect with one another because social dynamics are really critical to everything that we do, right? Unless we're going to be a hermit out somewhere in the woods somewhere, we're going to be having interactions with people every day to do social tasks, to do work tasks, to just the daily business of living. We are interacting with folks, so it's pretty essential. I mean, we evolved as a social species, so it really touches every part of every part of our lives. So that's why I think it's useful and important, and even as you said, in the introduction, right, a lot of people study humans in isolation, but that's only one part of this broader system that we really should be understanding how all of that unfolds in the broader context, because when we look at dynamical systems, what we find is that looking at one part of a system, can give us some insights, but then when we start embedding it in those larger structures, understanding those broader settings, we can understand more about that system. So whether you're interested in, visual perception or motor movement, the way that that is connected to the specific social setting in which those the vision and motor systems are interacting, it really does change based on how those unfold. So that was kind of a very broad answer in terms of why social things are interesting to me. And I think that the dynamical system approach is the one that is most compelling to me. It strikes me as the most sound way of understanding social interactions, because if you look at people, they change over time. They change within a given situation and a given conversation, right? You and I have gone through various regimes of interaction, from the introduction regime to conversation to me now monologuing, all of these different things. We change pretty dramatically. And if we were to reduce our understanding of social dynamics to a single instance, to a single measurement, we wouldn't really get the richness and goal directedness of the behaviors that we're really interested in.
Right.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, but
Okay.
but for the audience, a little more
Yeah.
clarification of like, so how
Oh,
so
sure.
so how exactly would dynamical systems approach would be a little different, or drastically different than other potential ways of studying
Yeah.
communication, which probably have been used before or not?
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, definitely. So under traditional views of social interactions, a lot of this has been limited by the technology that we had available. But the way that this would happen is that you might have people come into the lab and answer surveys about their reflections about their social interactions, or you might send them a text message to at random parts of their day and ask them to reflect on what they're doing, or answer a 1 to 6 scale about some aspect of their interaction. And from that, a lot of people would then derive a single value about your sociality, about the quality of your interactions, kind of aggregated across all of the kinds of interactions that a person might be having. And if you reflect on the kinds of people that you interact with, the kind of goals that you have, your interactions with someone who is helping bag your groceries at the grocery store, or your coworker, or a friend or family member, all of those interactions are very different. And so deriving a single value of your social life from any of those would not be a complete picture of who you are and how you are. You might be quite gregarious with your family members, but be quite, closed off in talking with people that you don't know very well. And so, when you think about the way that the research methods have tended to distill those numbers, it has left a lot of richness on the table from the ways that people have their lived experiences day to day. So by taking a dynamical systems approach, by not just taking a single value, but by studying the unfolding of our language, of our emotion, of our speech, of our movement over time, and being able to see not just one person, but studying two people together by bringing two people into the lab and having them have a conversation, telling them to have different kinds of conversations, doing video and audio recording, going out and having measures of people engaging in interaction on various platforms like Reddit, like Twitter, now X, recordings of people having conversations for television and televised debates and other things like that. All of these are slices that we get that none of them gives us the complete picture, but by studying all of them together, and by preserving the context sensitivity and time sensitivity of those interactions, we can get at a fuller understanding of how we interact with one another, why we do that, what the implications are, in a way that I think helps us better describe those things that we as people interested in social dynamics would really want to know. Did that do a better job?
And yeah, that makes sense. And is it
Okay.
academic curiosity or is it more than academic curiosity? Like so for instance, when you write grant proposals, like what do you pitch?
Oh.
Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm being
Uh-huh.
kind of
Uh-huh.
uncouth about.
No, so I think it's both. I think I'm one of those people who is just a dyed-in-the-wool dynamicist. I believe dynamical systems is not just an academic way of viewing the
Hmm,
world, but a way of understanding reality. I think it's a way that I think about all kinds of nonlinear causality, context sensitivity, all of these things. So
hmm,
yes, it is more than academic for me in thinking about the way that certain things converge, the way that we bring our history with us to any given interaction, phenomena of hysteresis, the fact that our present is with our system in a very real way. It has shaped the way that we got to this point,
hmm,
wherever we are. So the way that I pitch it though with grant agencies, I feel like because I am interested in a lot of these real world settings, I try to talk about it at a more human level, talking about what those motivating settings are, why they matter, how we can use the basic findings of understanding social interaction to improve social connection, to improve social outcomes, to improve societal functioning. I mean, one of the things that I'm really interested right now is trying to understand how we can use the basic science of social connection to improve things that are affecting all society, whether that's loneliness and the epidemic of loneliness that we have, the fact that society is fracturing in all of these ways that I think as a dynamical system really does that fracturing does have implications for things like how we come together to address systemic issues, how we come together to improve the worldwide challenges that are facing us. So whether it's addressing social justice or trying to mitigate climate change, I think all of these situations are ones that by understanding the richness and complexity, not just complicatedness of social interaction, we can then start to understand why our interventions about things don't always work the way that we do. Why, if you nudge a social system in one way, it might have very different
hmm,
outcomes, or why you can really push on a social system and then nothing happens because the input is not commensurate with the output in a dynamical system. It helps us understand why people don't act the same way that we do, societies don't act the way that we would expect it. And I think
hmm.
that by aligning, maybe by saying that by aligning our academic focus with a kind of the reality of our lived experiences, that we can better do both of those goals, changing society and improving basic science.
Okay. No, it is pretty profound. So, for instance, you talked about, non-local causality or multi-causality, context, specificity or context dependency.
Hmm.
Uh, so when you look at, and we understand, these are the factors, like things are multi-causal most of the times human
Hmm.
behavior, right? It's
Uh-huh.
non, it's
Uh-huh.
non-localized. I mean, there's sometimes there are global causalities,
Yep.
with top-down effects, highly context dependent, right? But we generally live in a system, and we have tried to manufacture the society over the last, decades, which is
Yeah.
the least context dependent. So for instance, our justice system is completely context independent, right?
Uh-huh.
Our economic system is context independent, uh, right? And most of the times our judgments of people, or in general, events and, how we interpret those, things are mostly, you know, single causality and very,
Yep.
very locally causal.
Yep.
Does not look beyond that. So do you think so do you think that this you mentioned, the loneliness epidemic and other in general, the ills of the society which we would like not to have. Do you think that's because we are a different system and we are trying to cope up with a different structure? It's like, a rat in a maze, and a rat is
Yeah.
not evolved to run in a maze,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, I do think that that's a huge problem. I think that the misunderstanding of humans as linear, whether in individual or at society levels, does then ripple through the system at all of these different levels, whether it's our scientific understanding it or people's everyday experiences. It really does shape um our individual reactions of it, our individual perceptions, and the system as a whole in the way that it's working. Because as you say, everything is designed to view a system as a series of individual pieces just kind of doing their own thing. But
Mm.
even if you look at how some of these phenomena can be best described scientifically, they're even when you're looking at a system that is designed to be modular, designed to be linear, you look at the results and you say, wait, this clearly shows nonlinearity. We see cascades, we see critical points, we see tipping points, we see all of these things that happen that are suggesting that we influence one another. We
Mm.
are not abstracted away from our social setting, from our larger historical context, from all of these different top down and bottom up effects. And so I do think that we are we really need to show other scientists and public policymakers that it is a more difficult way of talking about things. Yes, nonlinear causality, multi-causality, like equifinality, right? Like all of the, all of these things, equipotentiality, these are all really difficult concepts to grasp, right?
Yeah.
It's something that we don't tend to talk about. And I think that it challenges sometimes people's feelings of independence, especially in the US context. There's a lot of focus on the individual, and individual choices and individual freedoms and things like that, without a recognition that we're all acting within this larger system. And so for
Yeah.
the academic context and the cultural context, it becomes really difficult to convince people that this is the better way of doing it. But that's one of the things that I try to do in my academic work, is to try to show the utility, the viability, of these ideas, and to make tools that will make it easier for other scientists who are inclined to be able to study work and study social dynamics in a dynamical
Yeah.
systems way, to try to you know share this tool, share this perspective, so that hopefully in my little bottom up way, I can try
Right.
to create a ripple through the system.
No, it's pretty fascinating. So when you said the US context, and of course I was born in India, so I'm kind of a confused organism for the most part, and still trying to figure out things here and there because
Oh yeah.
when I was in India, I was not mature enough to understand that culture, and when I came to the US, I don't have the roots, to understand the culture.
Mm-hmm.
So now I have, in general, issues connecting, at every level, both East and West. But when I think a lot about individuality, because India tends to be more collective, the East tends to be more collective in terms of its approach a lot of times. And, sometimes I'm perplexed by individuality here because, let's take a common example, like having tattoos, for instance, right?
Uh-huh.
So I don't know if I'm correct, but my understanding is that it has a little history of rebellion and individuality, right?
Uh-huh.
But if everyone has a tattoo, right? So then the level at which you can be an individual is like, what tattoo do you have, right? So the scale
Yeah.
of individuality generally shift
Yes.
to the choice of the tattoo. But
Uh-huh.
at the level of tattoo, it's so much of collective thinking, right? So there's no individuality.
Yeah. Yes. And like the norm setting, right? Like you're getting
Yeah,
at this idea that norms aren't static. Norms
right.
are dynamic. That as you have this critical mass approaching, that
Hmm.
suddenly the gravity of a norm just kind of sucks everything into this new state, right? Like it shifts over time. And so I think that yeah, there are these various ways that you can point to what that means, what that looks like. And I think that even like I feel like a lot of times there is an illusion of individuality where people aren't
Mhm.
even recognizing the reason why we have this why people have this individual drive to individuality is because of a cultural norm, because of a cultural value
Right,
to do
right.
it. And so by adhering to the idea of individuality, maybe you might think about the fact that you are falling then into a cultural norm and you
Yeah.
are a part of this collective view of it. So it yeah, there yes.
It's pretty paradoxical, right? It's pretty
Yes.
paradoxical. And
Yes.
and
And
and then
uh-huh.
yeah. So you go ahead, go ahead.
No, 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 go for it. Go for it. I was just agreeing,
No,
but
I was saying that,
loudly.
even the fact that, like I want to be an individual becomes a very uh, kind of very collective behavior when you are living in a society which is individualistic.
Yes.
So being
Yes.
individual is actually following a norm than
Yes.
actually being
Yes.
not an individual, right?
Yes,
So
yes, exactly. And I think that, with a lot of that, there's not even an understanding that the only reason people can choose to make these individual choices is also because of all of the infrastructure that has come before
right,
with
right,
everything. We look to example for we look for example to people who are, supposed to be these people who have pulled themselves up from their bootstraps, made this, financial success. But even people who don't come from a history of money, which again with wealth inequality and all of that at all-time highs, and the family like the family lines along which those follow, right? Even if someone creates a company and is able to make a whole lot of money, a lot of that comes because we have educated a workforce in the US, because we have infrastructure that other people have paid for, other
right.
people educated those people, and we have tried to nurture this collective setting in which uh, no one person is truly alone. I think that becomes a difficult thing for people to really reckon with, partially because of the societal norms around individuality, which then makes you, anyway. Yeah, I do feel like this is something that it creates this paradox that's
Right.
quite difficult for people to break free of, even when we're studying as scientists in this cultural setting, is studying social dynamics instead of recognizing the embeddedness, the connectedness of all of it. There's this idea that we can just like pull people out of their settings and then assume that studying them in one setting will be representative of their entire social dynamics, instead of trying to ask these questions that are more nuanced and help us understand the context specificity. And sometimes there are going to be context invariances, and understanding both of those together helps us understand the social setting as a whole.
Right. But then where do we stop? So for instance, when you talk about collectives, you said like, these
Uh-huh.
things have been paid by, others, of course, right? So one can
Hmm.
argue, yes, of course, the others paid for, but it was paid for equally for everyone. So in the sense that if we
Yes.
have that infrastructure, one can argue that that infrastructure is available to everyone, let's say, for the most
Hmm.
part. But if that infrastructure is available for everyone, and if I make like a lot, or if I tend to be a massively successful person, then it is because of me, because others also had the access to the same infrastructure. So then, as soon as the access is leveled off, then there is no credit to the society or to the collective. It's about the individual again.
So I think this is also a difficulty in the linear causality, right? And also essentialism, which again I try to eschew this idea that there's something that is just one thing about a person that's static and you can always point to. Because if you take a dynamical systems view of development as well as social context, then if you're looking at why one person has become what they are, you have to look at all of the ways that they have been shaped and formed, and their system has been sort of nudged and prodded over time. And all of those exposures have then caused that system to spin out in this way that leads to differences. And that is
Mhm.
not a thing that is in my view anyway, something that's attributable to just that person. It's that person as a product of their settings, right? In the same way um, that we understand that a given social interaction has a bunch of different forces on it, we should also recognize that an individual over time is the product of a bunch of different forces on them. So this is something that I've been, I try to talk about too in a social context why taking a physicalist monist view of social interaction and of reality, right, by saying that there is only one sort of stuff and it is the physical stuff. If we recognize that, then we can't go to this essentialist view of there's just this that a person is a given type of person, but that instead we talk about a person being a product of the interactions that they have had with other people. So even a person choosing to take to take the step to found a company that then has all of these other intentional and serendipitous effects from that, that's because that person had a given set of interactions with their environments, with other people in their lives that caused them to then go do that. So recognizing that we are that there's an organism society mutuality in the same way there's an organism environment mutuality that we might think about in a physical sense for people in ecological crowds.
Right.
I think that can be helpful to conceptualize it that way so that we're still not saying that one person is responsible for their success in a way that's abstracted away from the rest of their social environment.
Right. No, that's very convincing. But then the person, I mean, to be honest, I was planning to go from like 1% to 2%, then to society, but we started pretty early with
Yeah,
the
let's
society.
do it.
We can always go
Let's do
back.
it.
But but my question is, then in that case, one can argue that the way we with a complex system, and we agree with a complex system approach that we need to democratize the sexes. So by that token, the failure has to be democratized as well.
Oh, I do. I think so. I really do think that both successes and failures need to be viewed as an aggregate sort of at an aggregate level, that we are all responsible for one another in this way, that we um, take into account the degree to which we can mitigate failures and improve other people's successes. So I'm totally on board with saying like both sides of that coin um, do fall out from this view.
Hmm.
So yes, I agree
Okay.
with you. And it's also why I think that if we think about our criminal legal system, for example, instead of focusing on individual punishment, it's better that we think about rehabilitation, where we think about ways that we can improve. Because again, as a dynamical system, we assume that things can continue to change over time, and it may just be a factor of changing the constraints on that system that then lead to different sorts of outcomes, as opposed to taking a punishment-based system for the criminal legal system, which then leads to, like, again, attributing blame to one person in this way that doesn't really get into account the broader systemic context in which that person is making the decisions. I don't know if that's where you were planning to go with that
Yeah.
question,
No, no,
but
it makes. I mean, of course, these are like kind of hardliner, generally, kind of topics, and
yeah,
people have very strong opinions on that. But from
yes,
a purely academic, idealistic standpoint, it makes complete sense. Like also in terms of long-term sustainability, you
yes,
cannot have a system because most of our artificial systems are not sustainable. We know that we have not made a machine which can last for like
yes.
centuries, but we have humans that have been lasting, or like organisms lasting for like millions of years.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. So definitely I agree with what you're saying there. The question is like, what do we want to optimize? Sustainability versus a particular viewpoint,
Yeah.
or
Yes.
right.
Agreed. And I think that that's one of those things that um bringing in other ideas, ecological values theory, Bert Hodges and others have really
Hmm.
focused on thinking about this idea of values not being an individual thing, but something that is specified within the environment, that we think about our connections to one another, our connections to the broader society. I think that um, goes to this kind of sense that,
Hmm.
what are we optimizing, what are we prioritizing in the hierarchy of values, not that there's a hierarchy, but that we may want to think about our connections to one another in that same kind of
Right.
way.
Right. So you mentioned, concepts like tipping point, for instance.
Yeah,
I'll go to each of these,
yeah, sure,
points. So let's start with tipping point. So tipping point,
sure.
we have a very famous book now, The Tipping Point, as well, right? So it,
Mm-hmm.
it has been in pop science as well for some time. And we
Uh-huh.
see tipping points at all levels. So for instance, we see tipping point at the level of individual's health or
Yep,
psychosis, for instance,
yep,
psychological health. Likewise, we see it in dyadic interactions where in different modes of interactions, one person is passive aggressive, one person is actively aggressive, or things like that. People snap, for instance, right?
Yep.
We see at the institutional level, institutes collapse, businesses fail. We see at the level of countries, we see at the level of societies where there are revolutions,
Yep.
right? So these tipping events are happening at every damn scale. And at
Yeah.
each scale, even for a parent, like when is a kid interested and is on the track, and when the kid is suddenly, get indulged in, all sorts of illicit things, it's kind of a tipping point.
Mm-hmm.
And in all cases, we are trying to prevent that tipping point to happen,
Yeah.
right? And in some cases, we are wanting that to happen as well, when the
Yes.
systems
Yes.
are
Yes.
malfunctional, right?
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
and we see that in a recent, like some of the events, for instance, people's dissatisfaction with the healthcare system, and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So there, people are like hoping for a tipping point in the other direction, the way the narrative looks like. So, so in one case, people are trying to avoid. In one case, we want to have a tipping point,
Yeah.
for things to change, because we know that after a tipping point, there's a change, good and bad. We can argue.
Yep.
So from an academic standpoint, we want to understand how far can we how much can we manage tipping points? Okay. Can we
Yeah.
induce tipping points? Can we
Yeah.
manage tipping points? Right? And can we
Yeah.
predict tipping points? So
Yeah.
where are we with the science of complex systems in terms of those three?
I think that those are, oh, that's a big question. So I think that at sort of basic, well-defined systems, like with grains of sand, right? Like being added to a pile. We have a good understanding of that because we understand the system, the underlying system very well. I think with a lot of other things, we just frankly don't know the systems well enough to be able to predict a lot of that because it requires us to have studied the system in such a way that we can provide a model for what we're looking at. So I think that there are times that we can, by looking at levels of instability in a system, at rates of change in a system, we could probably in a short term be able to kind of say, "Ooh, we might be approaching a tipping point." That doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to happen, but we could say it looks like we might be headed towards one. Um, but I think that's going to be something with a fairly short time horizon, and it's going to be something that we don't have any sort of certainty with. So in order for us to be able to get better at understanding and predicting these systems, we have to study them in a dynamically compatible way. We
Yeah.
can't just take a mean or a standard deviation of our system of interest and be able to think that we can predict something as dynamic in that it is changing over time with some sort of static thing. So while I think that we can in retrospect recognize times and we have these tipping points, like marriage equality in the US, the societal attitudes around marriage equality changed incredibly rapidly. Like that's a sort of a social tipping point that we can say, oh yeah, that happened. But whether we're in one in the moment, I think that's really hard. And the stickiness of those stable states of the attractors would make it, I think, really especially hard for us to predict with anything in, off in the future because in a tractor is
Yeah.
stable, and so it'll keep it there. So I think that theoretically it is possible that we could maybe get to that point, but it would require a whole lot more study in a whole lot more dynamically compatible ways.
Okay.
I don't know if
Okay.
that's an encouraging response, but
So okay. I mean, you can give me examples, from any scale at which we
yeah,
actually have a better understanding, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Any scale. It can be interpersonal, it can be, group level, or it can be, like the societal level. Because we definitely have failed to predict revolutions. We have failed to even,
Yes,
kind of manage those
yes,
historically, right? Even
yeah,
economic events.
yeah. So Till Frank did he did an analysis of US Congress voting patterns, I think around like uh, 2008 or something like that. And he did a tipping point model, if I recall correctly. But again, that was retrospective. It wasn't
Okay.
prospective. So with that, like looking at voting behavior and in the US Congress and discussions in US Congress. So it does exist, but again, it's not and
Okay.
I don't know of anyone who has prospectively talked about it. Um, there have been other kind of collective dynamic, not necessarily tipping point, because again, it's dynamic, but I was a co-author on a paper with a number of other people looking at Twitter conversations and collective entrainment around hashtags in the 2012 debates. And so what you see are these kind of rushes towards entrainment and then a falling away. So it's like a series of sort of collective gatherings around something, but because it's changing over time, you see a dissipation,
Mhm.
so a return back to another one. So it's not a stable tipping point. It just
Yeah.
goes to a place and then goes back to a different state.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
There is a competing approach, I don't, maybe not competing, but complementary. I mean,
Yeah.
I still have to resolve, the distinction. So,
Sure.
you see the network approach. So when we talk
Yep.
about brains, one can argue what is a node, what is an edge. These are all
Sure. Sure.
hypotheticals.
Uh-huh.
But assuming, we can attribute some, nodal nature to certain, areas or certain
Uh-huh.
functional behavior, and we can, attribute an edge to a certain kind of correlation,
Mm-hmm.
connectivity, or strength of connections, or any of the feature of interaction between the
Mm-hmm.
two things. So we have been thinking of brain as network for a long time now,
Yeah.
and historians like Neil Ferguson have very popular books like The Square and the Tower, Networks, and the Power of Networks, from the Freemasons to Facebook. And that network perspective has been used to argue that if you know the network very well, like the
Mm-hmm.
nodes, for instance, the most
Mm-hmm.
important node, and you trigger that node, you can
Mm-hmm.
actually lead to a precipitation of a cascading event of collapse
Yes.
or something like
Yes.
that, right?
Yes.
So, so are these two different systems, or different ways of envisioning, or they're complementary, or
I think they could be complementary. I mean, to me,
okay.
they don't strike me as mutually exclusive, because
Yeah,
with them, you're talking about interconnectedness among the system, with these neural nets. You are, being able to describe the collective level at that sort of same cascade
yeah,
approach. So I think that there's a lot of interest in bridging between network science and dynamical systems, modeling approaches, that I think could be a very fruitful avenue for future exploration, and a way of being able to implement some of the hypotheses that we have about how dynamics unfold, treating, even like at the level of society, individuals as nodes and edges as their social connection. Then you could be able to describe the way that they're interacting with one another, with these dynamical functions, and talk about these different ways that people can do that. So I'm reminded of some work by Whit Tabor, who's here at UConn, who kind of is interested in those kinds of questions, and takes a lot of inspiration at the intersection of network science and dynamical systems.
right. No, it's pretty fascinating because I was just thinking of from the academic standpoint, like
Yeah.
a lot of times, academicians, including us, we tend to be very theoretical
Hmm.
and showing less of actually the power to actually change things, like move the
Yes.
molecules or move the
Yes.
connections,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
we need to kind of figure out certain systems that actually demonstrate our
Yes.
ability to topple them or to build them using
Yes.
these foundations to be actually make a more convincing argument, because we
Yes.
cannot keep talking, in terms of the theory, for a long time.
Yes, I totally agree. I think that, with that, I'm interested in moving in, and I have some projects aimed at trying to take the lessons that I've learned and I've heard about from other people's, excellent basic science, and trying to do things to improve social dynamics through that. I think the double-edged sword with that is that we should be thoughtful about how we're making these tools, how we're using these tools, have in mind the way they could be misused, and not just the way that they could be used for good. So it's useful to kind of have that in mind, so we're not just sort of only optimistically creating these tools to help with social change that could lead to unintended consequences that could be, devastating for society. Thinking about the way that generative AI, the conversation is like our ability has far outstripped the sort of ethical norms that we're thinking about with how generative AI can and should be deployed. but maybe if as those of us who are interested in the application and understand it from basic science, if we are involved in these conversations about how they should intentionally be used, I think that is useful, rather than just can we do it without asking whether we should.
Mhm. Yeah, so you already are there, But the next question I plan to ask you was, what are so okay, maybe we can, go a little back. So
Sure,
if
sure.
when you do things in the lab, of course, you're not looking at the whole society and
Hmm.
as I mentioned, we skipped a couple of levels, before going to the society. So in your lab, what kind of experiments do you work on and what kind of data do you collect?
Yeah, yeah. So, the work that I do is really varied. I do work everything from one individual interacting in a in some kind of individual social context, like one person listening to or watching something and then trying to write or explain it to someone else. So you have this serial social interaction, but no direct interaction. Two people having a conversation, two people doing a task together, um, and all the way up to four people having an interaction together. So all of these things are done in collaboration with a variety of folks here at UConn, at other institutions, and primarily with my graduate students who all bring their flavor for whatever they're interested in social dynamics to bear on this. So one of my recent PhD graduates, for example, Megan Shavaro, was interested in dyads and four-person interactions, and so we had two people and four people come into the lab and do a task together that was modeled off of honeybee nectar processing to look at how people are interacting under these different constraints, to see whether the ability to communicate with one another, for example, or to take on different tasks and task switch with other people would change those dynamics. I have another graduate student, Katrin Hall, who is about to defend her dissertation very shortly. And she is interested in the practice of yoga together, everything from one person doing yoga along with a pre recorded teacher, up to groups of people doing yoga in a class together, and looking at how that practice of being with one another, of doing yoga with other people, has implications for perceived health and health rates in terms of heart rate dynamics and other things like this. So with those, she's got video, she's got heart rate. And so we're looking at those with various modeling techniques. I've also got collaborators like Vero Romero, who's faculty member at Colby College, and we have people come into the lab, have conversations with one another, and then also recruit people to have conversations not face to face, but over Zoom, for example, to see how communication modality changes the dynamics that we see for language, for speech, for movement dynamics, for emotion, things like that. So do a whole lot of different things, but my main goal in all of these is to be able to take the richness of interaction and be able to capture it with a degree of specificity so that we can get a time series and then be able to analyze how those time series will
Mhm.
change, and then see if those different time series, if maybe speech looks different when people are having these conversations versus the body movement that people are doing these different conversations. So um, uh, a lot of different things. I also do data analysis of things in um, people interacting in virtual spaces and online spaces. So, for example, in collaborations with Nel Verico and some other collaborators, we've looked at how people are collaborating on GitHub, how different software engineers and software developers are communicating in these different settings, to see how volunteer spaces change based on different social norms in those different online settings, with again looking at a lot of people interacting together in these settings, and getting a time series of the way that changes through people's goals and other things. So a lot of different a lot of different
Yeah.
methods. And so given that one of the other goals that I have is to try to make tools that other people can use, because I didn't come from a background that was very computationally intensive or anything.
Yeah.
I started grad work with Rick Dale, and he was very supportive in me approaching programming and computationally intensive things that I didn't have a background in. And so I'm very grateful to have had a mentor who was very savvy and was very willing to help, support me as I was learning all of these things. But I know that a lot of people don't have those opportunities. So one of the other goals that I have is to be able to create and share tools so that other people who don't have those tools, that time, that experience to learn from, can be able to deploy them and be able to get time series from the richness of the social interaction data that they might be collecting.
Yeah, it's pretty tough because there's so much is happening, and what you
Oh yeah.
count as an event or what you count as like
Yeah.
an interval
Mm-hmm.
is pretty challenging,
Oh
especially when
yeah.
it's a multimodal data.
Yes, yes, yes. And I think that when you're, depending on what you're looking at, you could get these different dynamics. And so one of the things that I'm really excited about is to have a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives be able to share why they made the decisions that they made, to share, if they can, the raw data that underlies it, and to be able to very clearly explain or share their code so that other people can kind of examine them. Because if we get congruence across a bunch of different metrics, then that's great. But
Yeah,
if we see these differences, these divergences in what people are finding, then we need to dig into that and understand what might be different in this, interturn interval. For example, if we're looking at
right.
the duration of the silences versus, inter-onset interval, the differences
Mm,
between just not ignoring just the silent times, but when people are speaking. If we see differences in those, let's figure out what that means and how that can work.
right.
And I think that the data sharing situation also brings into a lot of questions about
No,
data ethics and other
so
things.
this
But
has been this has been on my list, like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I know that you have been a really staunch advocate for open science as well as
Yep.
not just open science but about transparency and reproducibility
Yeah.
in
Mm-hmm.
psychology research. And we know,
Mm-hmm.
from lots of landmark studies now that psychology has become a poster child for the reproducibility crisis, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
After few of those famous
Yeah.
papers that try to replicate previous experiments.
Yeah.
So, but do you think so there have been a couple of arguments lately that a lot of reproducibility guys is not just because of the methods of transparency, but it's because you are trying to attribute a mean behavior to a very dynamical system, right?
Yes.
So do you subscribe to that idea that
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Also, just as a side note,
yeah,
something I like to point out when I cover the reproducibility replication crisis in my classes, I point out that it's not just psychology. Yes, psychology has a bunch of flashy studies that, like looking at the picture of a dollar could make you feel, more individualistic and other things that didn't replicate. And so people like to point that out. But medicine has one of the biggest reproducibility
it
issues,
is, yeah,
especially looking at model organisms, right? Like a lot of things work in mice that never work in humans. And
yes,
so I think that it's useful to talk about these dynamical terms exactly as you're saying, that when we understand the context in which these things are happening, and the constraints under which they're happening, that
yeah,
it helps us understand why things replicate or fail to replicate. And so
replicate,
if we understand that especially social dynamics, are so sensitive to a lot of different factors, that it might make sense if we were to report more, if we were to be clearer about precisely what we did and
right?
precisely all the choices that we made, we could be able to start carving out these dynamical spaces and understand the order parameters under which we're interested in these ideas. So
Hmm.
I think that if we look and see that certain topics of a conversation, if we just say people had a conversation task, okay, well, maybe your results won't reproduce because really you were having people talk about things that they care deeply about versus something that they didn't care at all about, right? And
Hmm.
maybe then the dividing line is what you're looking at is personal investment versus, not personal investment. Maybe that's the critical
Hmm.
the critical variable that's actually explaining the differences in those results. So I do also think that, with individual variability, a lot of people, even in dynamical systems, like recognize that people, that the setting matters, but also the individual organism does matter too, and what they're bringing to that interaction matters as well. So there could be important differences of people's experiences, their hysteresis, everything that they're carrying with them that could shape it. That's not necessarily obvious based on the conversation, what you're doing, right? Your participant is taking an hour out of their day to sit down in your lab, but they have their entire lifetime behind them and their future ahead of them that could be shaping the way that they're interacting in these ways. So I love that approach, that narrative that's coming out more that says, wait, 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 wait. Yes, there are people who are intentionally doing p hacking and other things, but those are the minority of people who are
Right.
doing it. Really, let's look to these principled reasons to say that every finding, unless someone acted badly, every finding we should say, okay, well, let's examine it. If it holds up, then the reason why it might not reproduce under different settings is not because of something they did wrong, but because of the dynamics of the system and the way that that's doing. So I'm so glad to see that permeating
Yeah.
more of that space, um,
I
and
think I
hope
think
to see
that's
that
the elephant
continue.
in the room. That's the actual elephant in the room. And we have given too much, to p-value, p-hacking, and effect size reporting and things like that,
Hmm.
much more than they actually carry the weight.
Exactly. And there's something to be said for for small but significant effects or small but significant results that come from this. If you see something that's reliably changing, right, that if we think in terms of people's everyday lives,
Yeah.
it's unrealistic to think that some 5-minute interaction or 5-minute
Yeah.
intervention in a lab is going to completely override everything that that person has experienced and everything, in a way that if we're that unmoored from the history that comes with us, what is that saying about human cognition and behavior that 5 minutes can lead to that dramatic change, right? So I think that
Oh,
in
I mean,
people's,
not just 5 minutes. Sometimes I'm thinking about, human interactions. I'm so perplexed. Like
yeah,
there's no man-made machine which can be influenced without sending some codes or without sending, some like real effect. But for a
uh-huh,
human, you can just say like three words. Like somebody can say like I love you, like 3 words, right? And that can
oh yeah.
change that person's
Yes.
self-esteem, their life, their
Yes.
like ambitions.
Yes.
They're going to like
Yes.
die for them. And then I hate you, and or like some kind of,
Yeah.
or like events of, sexism, racism, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
One that's nothing but like a sequence of 3 words which just tend to that that pressure wave tend to be just falling on your ear for like a few, like a partial fraction of a
Yeah.
second, and that can completely change the dynamics of the human body.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
fascinating to think, how profound that sequence can be.
Yes, because again, the with that, I think that's highlighting the dynamical system, the nature of humans as dynamical systems, right?
Yeah,
The pressure, the input is not commensurate with the output, right? You could read War and Peace to someone and not have the same impact as I love you or I hate you, right?
yeah,
The
right,
pressure
right.
of that, right? They're very different. And I think that with that's useful for us to not just measure the force, not just do a frequency or spectral analysis of those words, but to recognize in context everything that means, right? Like the whole broader social setting, because it's bringing a lot with it that's more than just the pressure waves on someone's eardrum.
So are you trying to say that the system is poised for a tipping point also in a context? So I am poised to have a tipping point to hear I love you or I hate you, but I'm not poised on a tipping point for other sequences. So even that you have like a multi, mm, like, so the idea that the system is, what's a technical word for it? Uh, critical state.
Yeah,
So the system has like multiple critical states
it could.
specific to different things. It's kind of looking forward to those tipping points.
That I think that's a reasonable way of thinking about it, right? In terms of that, people could be in these different ways ready for tipping points. Their systems could be poised for tipping points based on different things, right? Because if someone is walking by on the street and they say, I love you, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
not
yeah.
going to be the same kind of thing. You have the history of what has come with you and another person that
Right.
causes that to cause the tipping point, right? And so I think that um even as we're thinking about this, again, it's not a mechanistic view of those 3 words. It is the whole context of that, right? And because also other people who might be in a place where maybe those words scare them, maybe they've just
Mm.
recently gone through heartbreak, maybe that causes the complete opposite,
Opposite. Yeah,
organization
yeah,
of their system in response to it. So
yeah.
I think that not taking a unimodal or a mechanistic view of this, I think, is useful. to
Right.
be able to situate it within that person's context, within the context of that relationship, within the context of that broader social setting, and that person's own history and that dyadic history, right? And like it adds a whole lot of different variables to it that can be daunting, and it's why it is so much
Yeah.
easier to just take a linear view of stuff. That I
No,
think that it's,
no, our toy models of criticality are actually sandpile models, or like, network, threshold models are actually very kind of Euclidean in nature. So I think that kind
Mhm.
of limits our ability to think of like very hyperdimensional spaces in which
Yes.
criticality can exist
Oh, yes.
along multiple dimensions, at the same point,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yep. Yep.
So
And that, I think that's another limiting factor for a lot of the nonlinear spaces, whether you're meaning in neural in like network science, or you're thinking about dynamical systems modeling, and other analytic tools. The fact is that a lot of the tools that we have to date do pretty well with, a couple of parameters or a couple of dimensions. But if we think about the extreme, the hyper, the hyper sort of space in which we're dealing with this, right? Like we have so many different factors that if we were going to try to get in this hyperdimensional space, it wouldn't, I don't think that we have very many tools that could accommodate the actual number of parameters that might be relevant for understanding how people are really well described as a system.
right, right. No, it makes complete sense. And also, when it comes to reproducibility, also you mentioned, like not to, just count, but just to give an example, the idea on mice, for instance, it doesn't scale up. So scaling limitations are also, big problems in complex systems.
Yep.
And the implications are starting from the level of funding, because like how many researchers do we know who have written in their first few articles, this mice research, for instance, will allow us to do this on humans, and have
Yeah.
actually started working on humans within their
Yep.
lifetime, right? I
Yep.
know. So
Yep.
so most of the times they're not willing to scale things or even test, because you change the
Yeah.
scale and things break.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
And even being able to make predictions, right? One of the things that often that often happens when assessing funding things, for example, based on predictions that you might have about a system, if you're making nonlinear predictions around something that is a space that might not be as well studied in a nonlinear framework, it becomes very difficult to convince people based on that. So the scaling from a very simple system with very few parameters, and then trying to understand what this larger one would mean, where you actually could use the funding to be able to collect and process the data with the fidelity that you would really need to answer these questions, it can be seen as very risky, um, in the same way that scaling from mice to humans would be in other settings.
Yeah, so we're not taking enough risks to study the risky systems, when in
Yes,
fact,
yes.
right?
Yeah, and honestly, like I don't even think that they're risky systems. I think that those are systems, right? We
Yeah,
have created these model systems that are projections from a hyperdimensional space into that is nonlinear, right?
yeah.
Into this in this linear system. And yes, a lot of stuff can hold up with some spaces, but that's not really getting at the system. We have modeled the system in a way that is tractable. And I understand the constraints around data collection, research methods, data analysis, um, computational constraints are real, right? All of these situations have made it harder for us to study these spaces. But I think that it's useful to recognize that we have tried to get our hands around the problem with the tools available to us, but that doesn't mean the problem is actually best described in the language of those tools.
No, but also the traditional academic setting is also not optimal to
Yes.
study those, because the way academics works is that you have a PI. We are living in a pyramid scheme, right? Like a multi-level pyramid schemes. So you have like multiple PhD students, right? And the thing is that you have to train them from the scratch, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
every student has to be pruned, right? So it takes them
Hmm.
several years to be able to do something.
Yep.
And as soon as they are able to do something, they move somewhere else, right? Because that's how the system works, right? That's how
Yes.
the
Yes.
academic life cycle works, right?
Yep.
So expertise does not even, I mean, that's good for cross-pollination of ideas, but at the same time, things which need long-term,
Yeah.
stability, expertise, and collaborations. So
Yes.
funding cycles are small, PhD cycles are small,
Yep.
there's a lot of shuffling, and
Yep.
you have to manage the whole program, not just to research, but also to train. So
Yes.
all the competing demands doesn't allow for
Yes.
bigger things. It's made for
Yes.
small things.
Yes, I totally agree. And the fact that when we think about how academic job searches function, the way that tenure decisions function, the way that
Yeah,
higher other promotion considerations are, it's based on the things that are easily countable. How
yeah,
many publications do you have? How
yeah,
many grants do you have? Not recognizing that some of the serious thought work, some of the serious empirical and modeling work could take far longer than getting out, a handful of kind of lower hanging fruit that
mhm,
has happened. And I think that's one of the difficulties, that when people are going through the tenure run, there's a lot of pressure for people to say, leave aside those big ideas, just do what you need to get tenure, and then you can get to it. But then they get to tenure after at a sprint that they have been running for the length of a marathon, and everyone's
yeah,
exhausted. I'm very lucky. I'm very grateful to have just gotten tenure this, just to be starting with tenure this year. And it's hard to have that mindset shift that can happen sometimes. And I have seen friends, colleagues, other folks, go through this, where it's sort of this this giant sigh, where you have been under so much pressure, and you have had ideas and ways of thinking sort of squeezed out of you from the system that has just said, focus on this 6-year goal, let go of
yeah.
those broader ideas until after you're safe. And then what is that doing? What is that training? What is that reinforcing?
Right.
um
The
yeah.
reward mechanisms are completely kind of screwed up by then.
Yes.
And also those I think that's when you are a fresh blood, right? So for instance, your kids are small, or you don't have kids yet, or for instance, you do not have the financial trouble of, if your kids are too small, for you don't
Mm-hmm.
have that much pressures, or you just have more time and more energy because you're young, right? Those are
Yep.
like the prime time of your
Yes.
scientific productivity. And I myself, like most of the times I write grants, and like they sometimes they like, for instance, we have a recent grant withdrawn for some reason. Okay, after like months and months of effort.
What?
So for like, yeah, I mean
Oh
that was
my
a
God.
miscommunication between the program officer and us and others. So,
Oh, I'm
but the
so
thing is, the way
sorry.
it works is, like it's so counterproductive in general, the whole
Yes.
system for
Yes.
long-term thinking, because your prime time
Yes.
goes into writing for grantsmanship, but not actually doing science. Like
Yes.
and when you look at LinkedIn, we do not celebrate findings anymore. We celebrate grants. Like grants are a
Yeah.
means to do research. Grants are not research, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Right.
Yes. Yes. I
So
I totally agree with you. And like the fact that grant so much effort and time goes into the grant writing, and then if you don't get the grant,
yeah,
where has the time? It hasn't trained new scientists. it
no,
hasn't it hasn't helped even doing things like meaningful service to your community. You
yeah.
haven't helped review papers, you haven't helped chair a conference committee, you haven't helped make sure that your department can continue in the meaningful work it does. All you've done is just
Oh, I'll tell
throw
you,
some
I,
time.
I I did some calculations. Most of the grant money is actually used to get more grants and not science. Like that's actually the case right now.
That's
Uh,
so
and
disheartening.
the more difficult it is to get a grant, the more of that actually puts is being put. So you can
Yep.
have labs where postdocs are paid for 3 years not to collect any new data or not being able to do anything, but just keep writing grants. And as soon as they
Oh,
get a grant, they basically move out, like, fill a position, right? So it becomes like a
that's
vicious cycle.
heartbreaking.
But
Yes,
but but isn't that reality for
it is.
right?
It
So
is.
yeah. So with the
It's
with
just disappointing that we get in this to answer the big questions,
yeah,
or the questions that are motivating to us, the ones that we started this chat with, right? And then
right.
here we are, just sitting
No,
down and
it
writing
definitely bogs
grants.
you down. It takes a so I have a thing that and my one of my professors also agree that we do science despite of things than because of things.
That is so true. That is so
Right?
true. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that was a little distraction towards
No, no, it wasn't.
the
That was a honest conversation about the pressures facing academics.
yeah. So until they are themselves in the grant committees and they know everyone in the grant committee.
Oh, oh,
So
oh.
hopefully one day. So okay. So so Alexandra, could you describe, like, do you have some instances where you were running some experiments in the lab and you had those Eureka moments, which we often tend to read as, like, as, for instance, Archimedes, ran out
Yeah.
naked, with like
Yep.
the findings.
Yep.
So not comparable to that, but at least, with that feeling, like, did you had those moments?
Yeah. I think that the one situation where I was sort of stunned and stumped
Yeah.
by my work came from one of my collaborations with Vero Romero, who I talked about earlier, when we were looking at how people hold conversations across different media. Um,
Mhm.
so the goal of this study, we were interested. We'd known each other since we were both graduate students, and then we both get our faculty jobs, and we're like, okay, great, it's time for us to collaborate together. Finally, we can do this. And so we had planned, because I'm really interested in social context, understanding how when people are having arguments versus having friendly conversations, for example, how that reorganizes their systems, and how that as a contextual constraint leads to these different outcomes and these different moment to moment movement, language, emotion dynamics.
Yeah.
So from this, we take this very particular kind of approach to social interaction, where we talk about just like motor synergies, we talk about people forming interpersonal synergies, that the system reorganizes so as to meet certain goals together, but they can do so flexibly. They can,
Mhm.
if they encounter changes, they can reorganize that system to get effective performance in that same goal. Much like how the iconic thing, if a blacksmith is wielding a hammer, that hammer movement is made up of different muscle groups. The activation of the different muscle groups varies from hammer strike to hammer strike, but an expert blacksmith will still keep hitting the correct spot where they intend. So that's an example of synergies. And so we're really interested, with a number of other people across the dynamical view, and ecological view, of describing interpersonal synergies in the same kind of way. So in order to do this, you have to have a lot of data for people doing the same thing again and again and again. So we decided, based on work that she had done before, we would have people come into the lab, shake each other's hand 50 times, and then they'd have a conversation, and we'd have them shake their hands again 50 times to see if the interpersonal systems had reorganized.
50 times?
50, yeah, 50.
And
Before,
and you
uh-huh.
mean there was something in between, or like just shaking hand 50 times?
Just repeatedly shaking hands 50 times. Yep, yeah,
Okay.
it was going to be a lot. So we got IRB approval to start this um, in February of 2020. And then
Mhm.
the pandemic happened. So, of course, we weren't having people come in and shake hands so many times. So,
Yeah.
we thought instead about, well, what is this? What's the kind of conversation? How does conversation change now that we're all getting used to this virtual environment? So, we decided to run a study to see how different kinds of communication media might change the dynamics of interaction. And based on the findings, once we finished running the study and we analyzed the results, we found that the kinds of behaviors that we found reliably before the pandemic were completely changed, based on post-pandemic results. And so
Mm.
we found different patterns of interconnectedness before versus after the pandemic, where people actually seemed to find meaningful connection in having an argument about something that was deeply held with someone else who disagreed with them, versus having friendly conversations with them. And that was the complete kind of opposite of what we had found in prior work. And so what we hypothesized with, and that was the sort of result where I just had to run it and recheck and make sure that there wasn't something wrong in our data processing, because we'd
Yeah.
never seen this before. And so based on thinking and reading other papers that came out about the pandemic and our own lived experiences, what we think is that during a time of social disconnection, of social fracturing, the authenticity of especially these Gen Z students that we had
Mhm.
participating, the authenticity of talking about something that meant a lot to them, in a time when they didn't have people and they were feeling just so starved for connection, that actually did them some good, even though they were disagreeing with someone about something really important, gun rights or the
Okay.
death penalty or abortion or something like this, right?
So
So
it increased the
yeah,
tolerance, is it?
yeah.
Did it just increase the tolerance, or is it more than that?
I feel like it shifted it.
Okay.
I really feel like talking about something that is personally meaningful in a time when you have had all of your social threads cut because you're
Hmm.
alone, that suddenly you're starved to be able to, no, I want to talk about something that means something. I want to meet, I want to connect with someone. And so
Hmm.
talking about things that are kind of more surface level, about like things that you both like, things that you have in common, that's less meaningful to people than talking
I
about
see. I
something that's
see.
important. So
I
that's
see.
that's
I see.
sort of what I think. That's what we think is part of that. And so right
Yeah.
now we're running a replication, an extension of
Hmm.
that study where we're trying to get at some of those questions to see what
Right.
might have been driving it. But that was sort of the biggest eyes
Right.
open eureka moment that I can
So
think of.
they might not be that interested in short talks, perhaps.
I mean, I don't know,
Okay.
right? Like it's I don't know.
When you look at the larger societal narrative, of whatever the generation, the youngest or second to youngest is, it always looked down upon, like they're lazy, they are this, they are that, they're unproductive, they have this, like all
Uh-huh.
sorts of, and this has been happening, for like century. You go back
Exactly.
reading newspaper or media a century back,
Yes.
right? Generations are always
Yes.
lazy. What would happen to the world, right? Or
Yes.
n number of things, right? So you
Yeah.
realize that they're always stigmatized for whatever they do, no matter what.
Exactly. Yes, and so, with this, I one of the things that I have thought about,
Yeah.
in this is that it's is a way of not taking a deficit-based approach of younger people, but to say, they were, these students were more willing to undergo some discomfort with
Mhm.
one another, to have a conflict because they wanted to connect with someone versus people who I ran who were, in subjects who are probably closer to younger millennials who
Mhm.
just felt very awkward in those conversations, right? And so I think that recognizing that just like a dynamical system has these different patterns, that it's not a deficit, it's not a weakness of a younger generation. They just have different constraints, right? They change all the time. So I don't think
Right, right.
it's bad. It's just different.
So you can assume that I'm a better Gen Z than a millennial, because I tend to be more of that kind. Okay, that's good to know. Okay. So and that also, brings us back, as I mentioned, we'll talk about interpersonal synchrony and conflict. So
Hmm.
you kind of naturally, came to that. So when we look at the literature, uh especially with human coordination, whether it's
Hmm.
motor coordination, social coordination, we talk about
Hmm.
things like synchrony, right? And
Hmm.
synchrony or synergy, and they have a positive connotation to them. Like synergy is good, right? Generally speaking, right? Now, so when you talk about motor synergies, when you talk about like a neurologist, they can talk about synergies as bad synergies in a stroke patient, for instance, which are very
Mm.
counterproductive. But when
Uh-huh.
we talk about like the social synergies and social synchronies, uh, there's a assumed like goodness to it, right? Like
Yeah.
it's good that we are synchronized, right?
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit more about like when is synchrony kind of maladaptive? So we need to understand
Yes.
synchrony from both perspectives and not just, just one.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that part of the reason why synchrony has been sort of seen in this positive light is largely an artifact of the conditions under which it's been studied historically. So,
Mm,
for example, a lot of work on interpersonal synchrony, and other things, not just on motor but on language, for example, has come from relatively neutral settings. So, people just trying to do a task together, or things that are explicitly positive, people trying to bond with one another.
mm,
And so from this, there became this very simple narrative that there's this sort of more is better approach. The more synchronized people are, the better they perform, the more they like each other, the more they synchronize, right? In this sort of loop. But I think this gets to, again, one of the problems with viewing systems as linear, as modular, as always interconnected, is that because we haven't studied the synchrony system in as very in as very many settings as we have social interactions, we don't really know as much about all of the different modality specificity, all of the different, behavior specificity, context specificity as we would need. So assuming that all kinds of similarity, emotional similarity, movement similarity, speech similarity, gaze movement, so like where people are looking, and that all of those similarities serve exactly the same function and across all of the same settings, I think is largely because our research paradigms have been really difficult to do. And again, if you assume that you can take a sample of an interaction and generalize across all kinds of interactions, then that follows that you can be able to do that. But I think a
Right.
dynamical view helps us see that that's not the case. So I think that the synergies approach is a little bit less beholden to this narrative than is pervasive in the synchrony view. So for example, like just yes, synchrony is always seen as positive, or is tends to be cast as largely positive, but synergies I feel like it's a little bit more neutral, which I am pleased with, because right, you could think about these maladaptive coordinative structures that might emerge because it's creating this sort of rut in the system that based on these different sort of patterns or in these different goals. So one example of this comes from of maladaptive behavioral similarity, comes from some work that I did a while ago with an affective developmental psychologist, Alexandra Main, and my grad advisor, Rick Dale, where we looked at conversations between mothers and their adolescent children, and looked at the emotion that they displayed during those conversations, that each person displayed during these conflict conversations about topics of frequent and intense conflict, and then looked at how those moment-to-moment similarities between those emotions of the mother and their child had in relation to the outcomes that they showed. And when we look at the dynamics of those conversations, we find that overall, having shared positive emotion doesn't really change much. That whether you had whether you at the end of the conversation said it went well or went poorly, the positive shared emotion didn't really change that much, didn't have much of an impact. But the shared negativity, that the people were more likely to, if the pairs had higher negativity shared in the moment, that was a maladaptive sort of dynamic that was then captured by those post conversation questionnaires, their satisfaction with it. So I think that's one of those situations where the effect of shared emotion may follow the kind of emotion that it is within the context that's there. So if you're having a conflict conversation and both of you are really upset and really negative, then it stands to reason that, maybe just like you might look back on your own experiences, your own conflict experiences, be able to say, yeah, that probably wasn't great.
Right,
So
right,
does that
right.
help and
Yeah, yeah,
provide an
yeah.
example of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. So I would also like to ask you,
Yeah.
the role of cultural symbols, in synchrony. So, for instance, we have invented punctuations of interactions.
Yes.
So, for instance, good morning, hello,
Uh-huh.
bye bye, tata, right?
Yeah.
Or see you later, or some things like that, right? We have created punctuations, or excuse me, right?
Yeah.
Which have been recent. Like, it's not that our ancestors 5,000 years back were also like, in Egyptian civilization or in the civilization they had something like that. At least we don't know yet, right? What's the role of
Yeah.
these punctuations is actually enhancing or kind of suppressing these synergies?
As
Because
as
complex
a
systems generally do not have punctuated events, right?
But so I would argue
Yeah.
that they only have value within the given cultural context, right?
Yeah,
If
of
you
course.
say good morning to someone who is not an English speaker,
Yeah.
then that's not going to mean anything to them. So I
Yeah.
think that it serves as a coordinating. I think that it serves as a coordinating event between people because it helps coordinate their attention to a given thing. It helps, sort of like shared gaze, right? So humans tend to follow one another's gaze, and that's been shown to be pretty adaptive in a variety of different settings. It happens very early in child development, right? And I think that if you think about that as a learned sort of um, tool, as a sort of way of helping coordinate attention, so that it's not so it's you and I can recognize we're about to have a conversation. I say, hey, good morning, so that we know that this is starting. It helps us coordinate our attention more so as to be able to do something else. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that all kinds of
Mhm.
social I like that punctuation works, because if you flip someone off, that's a clear social punctuation, but that is not going to
Yeah,
lead to a good conversation. So I think that,
right.
much like other kinds of dynamical systems, I think there are contexts in which they would be helpful, contexts in which they would not be helpful, and that there's a historical sort of bringing along a historical significance that would have been be necessary in order to make that mean something.
Yeah. I was thinking of, like if you consider every human as like a machine or identity in its own, we're trying to learn the triggers to basically tune them. It's kind of a radio, right?
Yeah, I mean, but
Right?
if you think about it from, the sort of ecological approach, it like that makes sense too. Like, we don't have to be anything like a machine in order to learn, but we can become more attuned to our environment, attuned to others, become
Right.
attuned to specific interlocutors, so that we can
Yeah.
learn over time. And yeah, I think that that's what we are, is what we do.
Okay. That makes complete sense. Okay. The other issue is like conflict resolution. Okay.
Yeah.
So you have talked a little bit about that.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so what exactly is, so does asynchrony leads to conflict? Like how do we model conflict? Do we model conflict as a kind of synchrony or asynchrony? Because that has implications to how do we resolve conflict, because then we have to either find a synchrony or basically break a synchrony. So
Yeah. I think that one of the things that I have been pushing
hmm,
is that not all conflict is the same. So just like we say that not all conversation settings are the same, not all conflicts are the same.
hmm,
The kinds of conflicts that emerge between people who know one another very well would look very different than people who don't know each other. So a lot of the ways that I have studied conflict so far is by looking at it is not by seeing how conflicts sort of naturally emerge, but by inducing conflict, which is a
hmm,
different sort of thing than seeing how they naturally unfold. And so with that, what I see in the work that happened pre-COVID is that when you look at synchrony of movement, of speech, of language. So by speech, comparing speech and language, I mean non-linguistic, how are people taking turns, other things like this, not just the content. And so by language, I mean the
right.
content of what they're saying. You see these kind of disconnects that happen in conflict relative to friendly conversation.
Hmm,
Making people have an argument disrupts that system. Now, post COVID, there are some things that we still need to figure out. But even pre COVID, there were other people doing other kinds of work that operationalized conflict differently. So, for example, Reese Ramsire and Shosher did a study where they gamified conflict, where they assigned people to debate sections, like said, okay, we'll draw out of a hat a perspective and then have an argument about it. So there was no personal attachment, whereas the work that I've done has required a personal attachment to your perspective and then having them convince someone else who also has an attachment. And what they found is that, unlike what I found in with my collaborators, where we found that naturalistic conflict decreases synchrony, makes it non-distinguishable from zero, that they found that conflict that's gamified increases synchrony.
hmm,
So suggesting that there's like a degree of investment of trying to, much like in other kinds of physical combat sports, where you're trying to synchronize with someone else in order to be able to anticipate them and then break that synchrony strategically in order to win.
hmm,
That you kind of get that same sort of thing with gamified argument. So I think if you understand the kinds of conflicts that might emerge in the different multidimensionality, that you might need to do different things in order to resolve the conflict. Um, that there might be some spaces, some dimensions of that hyperdimensional space that you might want to become more synchronized with, and others where you don't want to, in order to effectively resolve the conflict. So maybe something like an epistemic level, where you're trying to talk to another person at this very deep level, connect with them, even if you're not synchronized in your movement or not synchronized in your speech. Maybe that's a level where you need to become aligned with them in order to show how your values and their values are similar in some dimension, and show them how your decision in the conflict helps them better realize those values, which is something that we find in persuasion literature, for example, that just throwing facts at someone doesn't do anything, but showing how someone better realizes their deeply held values with a different perspective is one way of improving that. So I know that's not a very satisfying answer, that I say, like so many other things, it depends, and we don't know enough about the system to be able to talk about it. But
Yeah.
I think that it's a way of us thinking about, again, context, context, context.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are very close to the end. Couple
Yes.
of big things. One is, for instance, rituals, right? I know you have worked with
Yes.
Dimitris as well, right? Who is
Yep.
one of the leading researchers
Uh-huh.
in the science of rituals. So
Mm-hmm.
where do rituals come into play? Where do cults come into play? And hypnosis. So
Ah,
because these are very different, like in one,
yes.
in terms of the control and interactions, there are very different kind of things are happening, right? There's no ritual
Yeah.
where there's only one person. Like, I mean, you can call your routine a ritual, but generally more rituals are social events,
Yes.
right, with
Yes.
synchronized activities.
Yes.
Cults are where there's a leader actually who is synchronizing everyone towards some
Uh-huh.
commonality. The same is like
Uh-huh.
with our stand-up comedy, for instance. Okay,
Yes.
and then you have one-to-one hypnosis works at one-to-one level, right? And
Yeah.
one can argue that cult and hypnosis have some commonalities.
Yeah.
So, do you have any thoughts on these larger kind of things from this?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to set aside hypnosis because I don't feel
Yeah,
like I know enough about hypnosis to be able to talk in any way cogently about it.
yeah.
Um,
To be
but
honest,
the
I don't know either. Like I've never
Oh,
been
okay.
hypnotized or I've never hypnotized anyone, but I have heard and read about it. So
Yeah, sure,
I know
sure.
what
Yeah,
it
yeah. Yeah.
is in movies. Yeah.
So I think rituals form much like the punctuation that you
Mm,
described, right? The conversational punctuation.
mm,
Rituals seem to serve a similar function. So again, I have collaborated some with Dimitris Xylotis, and we're working on some other stuff about conflict related to rituals and other kind of group identity situations. And I've been lucky enough to hear him present his work a lot and read all of his stuff. The firewalking study is just absolutely amazing. Anyway,
yeah.
so with all of that, it seems to serve a similar sort of coordinating function at the higher, longer, at the kind of higher scale, or the longer, slower moving scale, for people and in social groups, right? So if you think about it, it's about coordinating these identity things, about bringing people together, and they do seem to have these other longer lasting individual level functions, like
Yeah.
improving pain tolerance, improving mental and physical health, all of these other pressures, that it does seem to serve um, not just a moment to moment coordination or synchronization, like two people walking in time together, but is very psychologically meaningful in sort of a um, perpetuating those top down forces for a person in their social identity, and
Yeah.
constraining those interactions that come from that. I think a cult would be sort of um, similar in that some rituals do have a degree of a leader and a like group of followers, like a call and response. But it seems like a lot of the cult ideas, that at least as sort of immediately coming to mind for me, a lot of separation, from withdrawing away from society, while the nature of rituals are often that they're sort of transient, they happen and then you go out back into the world, and that
Hmm.
serves as this, if you think of in terms of a signal frequency, right, like that's a very like slow signal that's coordinating over these, maybe once a year kind of situation, that's helping maintain, give that power, for people. Whereas with a cult, you're trying to abstract away from all of the other signals that that person might entrain to in their everyday life, and just giving them this very rigid sort of system where there's no flexibility. You're removing a bunch of other, variability from their environment, and forcing that entrainment. And so I think this goes back to some of the ideas that I was mentioning earlier, where you were asking, how can challenging people who are interested in social dynamics to improve society with it. And I was saying, well, we need to be thoughtful about how things can be weaponized. I mean, this is
Yeah.
exactly that problem, right? The same sorts of processes that can lead to social unification and to healthy, vibrant societies can also lead to fragmentation. And so if you think about the same sorts of things with social isolation and fracturing that we have right now, we sort of have this weaponization in the US political polarization, sphere, where there's a hyperdrive of people being in their little clusters, which then necessarily brings with that some, competition among them and fracturing. So we've got these like very toxic kinds of narratives that are happening where again, it's just, I think, a matter of how we're using the tools that are sort of that could be good, but they can be
Mhm.
weaponized too.
Okay. Makes sense. So, what are you most excited about in the next few months to a year's timeline in terms of, where's your research headed, or like what are some of the big things we should look forward to?
Yeah. Let's see. I am very excited about a can, can I talk about the chapter? Is that
Of course, of course, of course. Yeah.
okay. So I'm very excited about this book chapter that my former graduate student, Megan Shavaro, and I wrote as part of the collection on metaphors for the mind that Madur and Damian Kelty-Steven are co-editing and have been pulling for this. So I don't know when the timeline
So,
is
so
for
the
that
book is
actually coming
book
out.
is due on 31st of December. So we are
Okay.
almost done. We have a little bit of, acknowledgements and things left to write. So hopefully in three
Yep.
to 4 months it should be
Oh, great.
there. Yeah.
Great. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what everybody else wrote about that. Megan and I are proposing a view of the mind using the eusocial insect colony as a metaphor for the mind. Building off some other ideas where people have talked about eusocial colonies for individual kind of things, or just taking a step back, eusocial insect colonies they are insects like ants and honeybees, where there are these distinctions that happen among their roles. They're not interchangeable like a swarm. But they work together for the goal of the colony, the good of the colony or the hive or whatever their unit is called.
Yeah.
And with that, we're really excited about this as a metaphor for cognition, because and the mind and brain, because it gives us this opportunity to talk about sociality as being really important to individual cognition, and as part of this kind of scalability that we can have from individuals up to larger scale collectives. So I'm very excited about that. But then, like I said, also really excited to see what other people have to say about it, and
Yeah.
about these metaphors. So I'm looking forward to that. Oh, and I'm also, I mean, I don't know if this counts as things I'm looking forward to, but I am teaching the Foundations of Cognitive Science class for our cognitive science majors here at University of Connecticut for the first time. It's been co-taught in prior years, and now I get to teach it. And so I'm really looking forward to infusing that multidisciplinarity into the classroom, and being able to talk about that, and emphasizing the embeddedness of individuals within
Yeah.
societies and dynamical ideas and all of this. So yeah, those are a couple things I'm really
It's so
excited about.
satisfying to, kind of teach students some of the new stuff, because a lot of textbooks are basically decades old and theories are decades
Uh-huh.
old. So it's fun to
Uh-huh.
include, new things like which
Yep.
none of the textbooks can actually have
Yes.
to have in your classes. It's pretty damn satisfying. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and if any of your listeners have suggestions for things, I'd be super excited to hear about those as I'm planning. I'm not using a textbook because I haven't really found one that I like. So at least this time around, I'm just going to do primary source materials and other things. Plus, I'm a big open source, open access person. So um, I'm trying to find a bunch of different things and cobbling them together. So
Well, I love open science, except that when I published this last book, and it was
uh-huh.
just 2 days, I found the PDF of the book online. And then my royalty statement came, and that royalty statement was not enough to buy a dinner.
Oh
After
no!
after
Well,
after
that's
months and months of work. So,
that's
so
that's different than open access though. Like so,
it,
but when I say that, I mean I try to publish things
it
under like an open
yeah,
license
but
so that
that's
people can
kind
do
of an
that.
open access, like forced open access. But I have read so many books, like just
Yeah.
downloading them. So I myself am, part of the same open access, forced or coerced or
Yeah.
whatever you
Yeah.
call it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the thing. Hopefully this time we can get like more than a dinner. So
Yeah.
for viewers, this is a very this is an upcoming book we have called on the theme of alternative to the computational metaphors of the brain and mind. And the idea is that we have relied too much on the computational metaphors, and they have
Mm-hmm.
they have huge limitations. And you would actually love the book, Alexandra, when it comes out, because when you read the book, there are about 15 chapters. The book has done a really good job in at least, defining the limitations, like
Yeah.
stark contrast to how the metaphor completely fails. And that's
Yeah.
probably the only metaphor that is big enough where no matter what evidence contrary to it comes, we just ignore. We just ignore, ignore,
Yeah.
ignore.
Uh-huh.
It's like it has become like a cult. Okay,
Yeah.
it's uh, completely it's falsified to the extent it
Yep.
could be, but it still persists.
Too
And
big
then
to fail.
too big to fail. It's too big to fail. It's too heavily funded to fail. Okay. So then you have alternatives, and one can argue that one alternative is better than the other or not, and
Sure.
maybe alternatives themselves have limitations of what they can,
Yes.
look for. But definitely, it is a good try from a lot of diverse people. But the common theme, the thread which runs across the chapters, it's everyone is primed in complex dynamical systems, and somehow every metaphor is linked to the idea of complexity,
Oh, that's amazing. I
complexity,
love that.
unpredictability, things like that.
Oh,
So it's pretty fascinating. So for
that
viewers
makes me
interested
so
in,
happy. I can't
yeah,
wait to see it.
same here. So I'll keep you updated as well as the viewers. And
Excellent.
thanks, Alexandra, for being on Beyond Phrenology. I'll post links
Of
to your
course.
webpage as well as to a lot of your fascinating work, in the
Oh,
notes in the
thanks.
video. And
Wonderful.
hopefully we'll see you around next time, or probably in a panel.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. This has
Yeah,
been an absolutely fantastic conversation.
yeah, my pleasure. See you, Alexandra. Bye.